Hello, my name is Chris Gentle, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this edition of Off the Shelf, a book discussion series brought to you by the Conference Board. And today I'm sitting down with Marc Goyder, the author of a new book called Entrusted, Stewardship for Responsible Wealth Creation. So let me tell you a little bit about the book, which is a fascinating read on a topic which is absolutely critical for our times. Obviously, we are dealing with the COVID pandemic at the present time, but corporate governance faces arguably more changes in the coming decade than we've had in the past 100 years. And stewardship will be absolutely kind of central. And we're delighted that Marc can join us today in order to kind of talk to us about the book. Marc, can I ask you, first of all, just to talk a little bit about yourself and your co-author, and actually, what was the story behind how the book came about?
Thank you, Chris. Well, I spent about 15 years in posts as a manager in manufacturing companies, including 10 years in the paper industry. At the end of that time, I'd been quite involved in one way or another in the political system. I'd been a county councillor. I'd started to look wider at what I felt was missing in the way business operated in society. And I had the good fortune to go and work for the Royal Society of Arts, where I had the opportunity to create something called the Tomorrow's Company Inquiry, where we brought together business leaders and started to ask them, are you happy with the way that things are? This was in the 1990s. And the business leaders concerned, as they sat around in private dialogues, clearly weren't happy. Privately, they were very self-critical about how business was failing society and how they wished it could be different, but none of them quite knew on their own how to do something about it. And they were very positive when I said, well, why don't we have a business-led inquiry, which is called Tomorrow's Company, the Role of Business in a Changing World. We set that up. We ran that. At the end of that, I was invited to set up a Tomorrow's Company think tank because they didn't want what was just a project to cease to function. And Tomorrow's Company has been running ever since 1995, 96 when we set it up. And it was through that I started writing about what I called exploring or rediscovering the human needs of business, the human purposes of business. And it was through that I was approached by Ong Boon Hui, a Singaporean who had a very different background. He'd been a general in the Singapore Army before he went into the private sector, and then went to work for the great investor Temasek, based in Singapore. And he said to me, "Let's work together," and we did. And then we said to each other, "Let's do a book together." And so, hence, Entrusted.
And one of the things that's really interesting reading the book is that the Tomorrow's Company example you gave was really around what was going on, arguably maybe in the UK and Europe. But your co-author here enables really to kind of spread this out into a landscape about actually corporate governance is going on around the world and some of the issues and similarities that are facing that. Could you just say a little bit about how you brought that global perspective to the issue of kind of stewardship?
Yeah, I think one of the great things, certainly for us as authors, I hope it comes across for readers as well, is the exhilaration of exploring both the differences and sometimes the commonalities between the philosophies of East and West, and indeed the practices of East and West. And I'd written quite a lot about Indian companies, and I was fascinated to learn much more about Asian business. One of the things that always struck me from my earliest reading about different business attitudes around the world is the way in which they view time. I don't know if you've come across this, but if asked to draw time to present time graphically, an Asian manager typically will draw time in some kind of a cycle. An Anglo-Saxon manager will draw time in a linear way, probably as a straight line, maybe with a few zigzags in it. And I think that says something about what we in the West can learn from the East, but the East has a lot of respect for some of the legal traditions, the corporate governance traditions that they see here in the West.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely fascinating, that example there about how in the West in particular we can be far too kind of linear. And I think in terms of the issue around stewardship, that we're talking much more arguably about the circular economy, aren't we? COVID, if we could just think about actually in the context of where we are. Obviously, COVID is a thing we're dealing with at the present time. But it's, as I said in my introduction, that arguably even capitalism is facing quite turbulent times at the moment, and arguably in a crossroads. One of the quotes in the book is from Eric Schmidt, who used to be, I think, chair at Google, and was talking about actually kind of dealing with just kind of paying taxes that were required. And I think the response in the book was actually that we need to go beyond those kind of responses. And I was just wondering what your view is about the position that we face ourselves in terms of wealth creation and capitalism at the present time, in the kind of context of the book, and what you were hoping to achieve, really.
Well, COVID has brought to the surface many of the issues and discontents that were bubbling somewhere near the surface.
Mm-hmm.
It was very telling, and we talk about this in the book, that across the world, the Edelman Trust Monitor was reporting that only 1 in 5 of the world population sample they surveyed thought that the system as a whole, that's the economic system, the political system, the sort of public system, was working for them. There's a real sense across the world that I'm disconnected from the way decisions are made. Decisions don't seem to be working well for me. Obviously, the business has suffered an enormous loss of trust, but that goes for government and many other sectors as well. That's before COVID. And I think a lot of the problem has been that we've seen what we would call extractive capitalism come out on top rather than stewardship capitalism. What do I mean by extractive capitalism? I mean, we're talking about the kind of people who see their role as being to make money at the expense of somebody else, as opposed to the kind of people who are just as much capitalists, but they actually see their role as making money by serving the needs of fellow human beings. And if you look at companies like Unilever, for example, and the way they've transformed themselves over the last decade under Paul Polman, that would be a very good example of a stewardship capitalist. But there are many examples. If you look at some of the worst of the drug companies, there was one called Valiant, which I think put up its prices because it thought it would make more money for shareholders by something like 600%. People don't like the extractive capitalists, and too often the whole of the capitalist system is now tarred with that brush. Mm-hmm. And now along comes COVID. And if one thinks about drug companies, what is so fascinating is suddenly we're in a situation where even the more extractive the drug companies dare not say, well, we'll just put the price on our drugs, which will exploit the market to the full. Because the crisis is so extreme that even they have to start realizing that actually business has to be about serving human purposes. And by the way, if you tread across a certain line of public approval or disapproval, if you ignore what we call your license to operate, you will end up in a situation where you lose money in the end. You might make money in the short term, but you'll lose money in the end.
Mm-hmm. And I think your example of what Polman did at Unilever is very apposite in terms of that. You look at what Unilever did, but also you look at its financial performance, and actually the two things were outstanding in both. So it was not a kind of question of doing some of the things that Polman did and suffering a financial loss. That there is a way of actually kind of moving forward in a much better way, as you kind of just talking about there. And it really kind of your diagram of the Western linear and the Asian kind of circular is again comes to mind really in terms of where that is. In terms of the book, returning to the book, in terms of the way that you have tried to kind of basically capture that, can you just briefly kind of talk about, I think you used the elephant analogy, about ways of thinking about how we can kind of move forward on this?
Yeah, we use the elephant. Poor old elephant had to work pretty hard in the early chapter of the book. We use the elephant in three ways. We first of all talked about the fact that elephants are grey, and many of the issues that business faces they're not black and white. It's not serving shareholders or serving society. It's how do I reconcile the two? We talk about the elephant in the room. We talk about the way in which sometimes the words like corporate governance, CSR, corporate social responsibility, ESG, they become labels, and in time, if you're not careful, they become substitutes for thought. And you get these kind of easy knee-jerk answers to crises. We're saying, oh yeah, that company failed, but of course it failed because it didn't follow good corporate governance. Well, actually, I think we need some rather deeper thought than that. And I think the trouble about the whole of this panoply of ESG, CSR labels is that they forget the entrepreneur in all of this. They forget that business is entrepreneurial. And that brings us to the third element of our elephant analogies, which is the one about the old one of people trying to describe an elephant who are blind and who they can only see the bit that they can't see. They only touch the bit that they can reach, and everybody describes the elephant in a different way because they're only describing part of it, and that's really saying it's desperately important that we have systemic thinking, that we embrace the elephant as a whole. If you can embrace an elephant as a whole, it's a bit of an ambitious proposition, of course, but we embrace the elephant as a whole. We interconnect our thinking so that we align the need for really commercial and entrepreneurial drive with the need for accountability, transparency, and a sense of responsible ownership, which is what we believe the principles of stewardship, as embodied in the classically best-run family business, embody.
Great. Now, thank you for that. And I want to dive into the specifics. We're going to take a short break now for some quick announcements, and we'll be back in just 1 minute to continue this fascinating discussion with Marc on Entrusted.
Looking for additional business insights in this subject area and beyond this podcast, go to tcb.org and explore our Human Capital Centre. Uncover a large array of products hosted by the Conference Board in focus areas like diversity and inclusion, talent management, and many others. Products include peer-to-peer networking events, expert briefings, publications, data and analysis, webcasts, videos, and blogs.
Hello, and welcome back to our conversation with Marc Goyder, author of Entrusted, Stewardship for Responsible Wealth Creation. Welcome back, Marc. That fascinating discussion in terms of the context of what we face in terms of both kind of COVID and changes in capitalism and wealth creation. And your book really kind of captures about the how-to. And that's where I want to kind of try and move now, if that's possible, to cover an enormous amount of ground in the book and try and condense it for our listeners in terms of what we think that business, or you think that business executives might do. Could I suggest we kind of focus on three areas: the kind of internal activities and stewardship of purpose. The second will be around, what governments might do around long-term wealth creation. And thirdly, around engaging investors. And I know that, chapters pick up on each one of these, but maybe we could just break it down into those three bits and you could tell us more about each. Could we start with the kind of purpose and internal stewardship?
Absolutely. Purpose has become partly I'd like to think as a result of the work of organizations like Tomorrow's Company over the last 25 years, purpose has become much more talked about. But what's it really about? It's about the human purposes of business. It's about putting the sense of serving humanity at the very heart of entrepreneurial activity. So the first thing I'd say to any executive, particularly post-COVID, is review and refresh your organization's sense of purpose and of values. And I think purpose and values are very important to think about together. It's all very well having a stated purpose, but it comes to life in behaviors, and behaviors are driven by the values which drive the culture of the organization. And the example that one of the examples we give in the book, which I think is a brilliant example, my colleague Boon Hui provided, was of the management of the Chinese white goods company, which was so fed up with the poor quality of their products that they wanted to dramatize the new refreshed purpose of the organization. They actually assembled about 60 failed washing machines, issued employees with sledgehammers, and asked them to destroy them. A memorable illustration of a new commitment to quality. But purpose and values are then important for the second thing that I'd be saying to that executive, which is, how do you liberate the entrepreneur among the employees in your business? If you're a larger, especially a mature business, you don't have to go to the extremes of issuing them with sledgehammers for existing products. You can be like the current day equivalent of Toyota, empowering them to stop the line. You can be like the British company we quote in the book, Unipart, which invested deeply in the Unipart way and in recognizing and rewarding those behaviors which are aligned with putting relationships and the customer first, and serving the internal customer as well, whether it's the supplier, the community, or your colleague better. And even working with suppliers who come and ask for a price increase by saying, well, we don't want to give you a price increase, but what we do want to do is to give you some of our experience so that you can reduce your own costs of activity. So those are all ways in which you liberate the entrepreneur within your business. And I think the third thing I would talk about, which is something more of a board level thing, which is this: look at your own ownership and your own corporate form. What kind of company are you? Are you owned by private equity? Are you owned by? Are you listed? Are you owned by a family? It doesn't have to stay the same way forever, and it may be that your current form of ownership is inhibiting you from doing some of the longer term things you want to do. Look at a European example like Handelsbanken, who decided to set aside a proportion of their profits into a trust fund, which is owned on behalf of the employees. And the employees are now the largest collective shareholder in Handelsbanken. So that Handelsbanken is subtly and steadily, progressively changing its corporate form. I think more and more businesses will need to do that. Otherwise, they'll find the conflict between the short-term expectations of some over-dominant shareholders getting in the way of the long-term ambitions and values of their leaders.
That's a very interesting thought. I mean, in the book, I think you describe it as the board as the steward, and
yes.
In a sense, is that kind of a cri de coeur to basically to try and actually kind of get more active boards about thinking about what they're passing on? I mean, again, we go almost back to your sketch diagram, which is basically that if you're thinking about this as a linear line, at any point you can jump off. Whereas if you're thinking about it in something that's much more circular and connected, that you don't jump off. Is that what you're talking about in terms of corporate governance, making it much more kind of active in terms of that longer term value creation?
Yes. We talk about stewardship as the responsible and wholehearted, and that's a word that Boon Hui gave me, and I love it. The responsible and wholehearted management of entrusted resources and relationships, so that we pass them on in better condition. I think one of the things that concepts like Western corporate governance miss is the vital importance of time. Stewardship recognizes that you've come from somewhere and you're going to pass things on to somebody else. And that sense, again, as you say, of the cyclical rather than the linear nature of things, then brings out for the board this responsibility to think about what they're passing on. And governance has become too dry, almost, I sometimes rudely say, too anally retentive. Just saying, well, has this organization followed the tick box rules? Has it separated the role of chairman and chief executive? Has the chairman been there too long to be independent? Well, these things differ for different businesses. I'm very suspicious of one size fits all rules. We need to get to the spirit of good corporate governance, which I think stewardship gives us.
Yes. I suppose one way of looking at this is that corporate governance never makes the headlines for the right reasons. So you only ever read in the financial press in particular about where corporate governance has gone wrong, where there's a scandal. But actually it's the basis of very, very kind of successful organizations where stewardship is right, where the corporate governance is right, and the culture is right of the board. It can make the ultimate difference in terms of providing that kind of return for shareholders and doing the right thing.
It does.
May I just construed?
I'm sorry I interrupted you, Chris. May I just add one thing to that?
Sure.
I mean, we think of the company as a living system where employees are its lifeblood. Management's the heart, which keeps the blood pumping. Strategy's the brain. Measurement and communication are the central nervous system. But leadership and entrepreneurial energy are its soul and spirit, and governance and accountability are its rhythms and disciplines. They're like exercise. They're a means of keeping this living organism fit and lean. And I think unless we understand governance like that, we miss the point.
Now, we talked about some areas. Investors is one area that we also kind of touched on. And again, I think that you argue for something that's a little bit more proactive in terms of maybe what the board can do, the leadership can do in terms of, who do you want in terms of ownership and what kind of investors do you want?
Too many
if you're a listed
boards
company?
seem to
Could you tell us more?
assume that they are simply there to do what the most influential or the most numerous of their shareholders want them to do. But that is to get the origins of companies and it's to get company law completely back to front. Let's think about it. Companies are started by entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs then go and seek shareholders so that they can get some capital to put their ideas into practice. And therefore, there is rightly accountability to those shareholders. But that is not the same thing as saying that the company or its board are simply there to serve shareholders. The board is there to serve the company. If the company does well, the shareholders, along with other stakeholders, will do well. And so we argue that a good board and a good chief executive and chairman will be going out to seek those investors who are most likely to support the direction of the company that board envisage. And the attitude to other investors who may be wishing to extract something in the short term the board are not comfortable with should be, okay, guys, if you don't like us, you can always sack us at the next AGM. But while we're here, we believe we have this mandate and we're going to stick to it. I think there are too few boards who truly understand the need to lead their investors and to seek out investors who will support their leadership rather than be followers.
And one final area then is that we mentioned of these three that we haven't touched on maybe very briefly is that government again isn't passive in this in terms of what you share within the book. You think that government should be quite active in creating stewardship?
Indeed. In brief, the state as steward is the subject of one of the chapters of the book, and we talk there about, why isn't wealth creation like the desire for the population's health or the desire to uphold good law through it? Why isn't long-term wealth creation an absolute central pillar? It's not any one thing. We don't want governments that just sort of suddenly wake up to wealth creation because there's a big fuss about how a few fat cat leaders are being paid. That's the worst kind of government. What we want is thoughtful, long-term systematic commitment to wealth creation, which covers everything. The government's role as a shareholder. Can the government, when it's a shareholder, behave in a long-term way? The government's role as a rule maker. Can it make sure that company law reinforces boards which are looking to approach the long term? The government as a tax setter, similarly, can it make sure that the extractive capitalist is not rewarded, and the capitalist who's investing in R&D and investing in the health of communities is in a better position? And finally, the government as a client and a buyer of services. And Tomorrow's Company has actually been involved in developing a British standard, which is about public procurement, which favours companies which follow these stewardship principles. All of these are ways, consistently and coherently, in which government can promote better stewardship and a more human capitalism.
And may I add, probably one thing that we take for granted in terms of wealth creation, particularly in terms of the COVID economic implications and things like that. So very, very wise words. We're nearly out of time. I just wanted to ask you one final question, which is that the book really gives us a kind of positive view about what we can achieve with capitalism and wealth creation over the next 5 years. And I just wondered if you could just kind of capture that essence of what the book calls for in terms of that positive view of the future.
I'd love to think that in 5 years, 10 years from now, a typical 30-year-old embarking on a stage in their life where they know they've got to start putting money aside into some kind of pension and long-term insurance arrangements would be saying, okay, I have a choice. I know that I can go to funds which positively seek to promote stewardship capitalism rather than extractive capitalism. It's not the only criterion. I've got to think about spreading my risk across different sectors. I've got to think about obviously differences between types of investment that fit my particular risk, liability matching, and all of these things. But actually, for the consumer to be able to go out there and buy in their investments a better kind of capitalism, in the way they can go into their supermarket and buy a fairer trade of coffee, is in one way what I think is needed for the future. Alongside that, I think what will be vital will be a tremendous decentralization of our government, so that people again feel the system is working for them, because they can actually see where decisions are being made that affect their own communities. And I think this is post-COVID. We've learned, certainly in the UK, we've seen communities having resilience forums, and they've had to work together. And I think those two things combined, the flow of capital into the right kind of businesses and the flow of decision making into the right local kind of communities, would embody my vision for both a society and a business that better serves human purposes.
Well, thank you for that. And I think congratulations on a fantastic book on an issue that they say that it's better to be lucky than smart. I think you've been smart rather than lucky in terms of honing in on this issue in terms of where we are at the present time. It's a fantastic read, and I would recommend it to everybody. And thank you for your time today. Thank you for everybody who's listened today. You can get this book at all good booksellers and Amazon, I'm sure. In terms of being able to get hold of a copy, I would recommend it. I hope you enjoyed this issue of Off the Shelf. Please remember to subscribe. And you can get to all our discussions and podcasts there at any good channel for podcasts, or at the conference board website at TCB at podcasts. Thank you again, and thank you for listening. Goodbye.